All right, thank you. Welcome back to the live feed for those who are not in the room. I appreciate you coming back from lunch. We hope you had a good lunch. And we will go ahead and resume the last half of our day. So Charity and Karina, if you would, please.
Right. So next up is Paul Damphus presenting for the Innovation and Infrastructure Working Group. Paul, over to you.
Okay, great.
Can we
Thank
get
you.
Paul's slides up? Right?
Yes, indeed. So while we're doing that, I'd just like to say thanks to everyone in the I&I Working Group for great contributions over the last couple of years. Special shout out to Dale Nash for the previous 2 years where he was the chair of the, I think we called it something different back then, where I was his co-chair, but it's been a good 4-year run here, 2 back-to-back 2-year periods. But great work by Lee Rosen as our co-chair. Of course, like I said, Dale Ketchum has really jumped in on a lot of the difficult tasks for us. Sharon Pinkerton, General Ed Bolton. And of course, it should be noted that we lost Senator Carnes as a member about 1.5 years ago. But I also did want to comment on both Charity and Karina. Both your leadership has been fantastic. I think we've really produced a lot of great output under both y'all's leadership. And of course, Jim and your staff, always helpful, always very, very responsible. So yeah, it's been a really good run, and I think we've got some good topics to cover here as we close out this session. We'll do our best to get us back behind schedule here. Way ahead. The first topic that we have for today was concerning global climate change. Obviously, that's a very, very big topic with lots of different aspects. So we did have a lot of interaction back and forth with Jim and his staff, and we really zeroed in on focusing mainly on the spaceports aspect of it. So Dale Ketchum led this topic, and I'll note that Kate Cronmiller participated as well. Thanks, Kate, for your contributions to this. Again, it's not an easy topic, but I'll kick it over to Dale.
You can do there if you want.
Okay.
Great. We won't have talks.
Yes. Very good. This actually should be relatively motherhood tasker for the most part. I think there's certainly not a great deal of controversy in the fact that what we're addressing specifically is the impact of climate change on spaceports. And with that as the definition of our tasker, I think what we were trying to focus on, and again, big thank you to Kate for doing most of the heavy lifting on this and really fleshing it out. I think for the most part, what we were trying to do is, apart from the obvious need that spaceports are going to be impacted by climate change, as is every other thing that humanity does. So how do we address this in a fashion that will provide some clarity and some distinction for the FAA to better solve this problem specifically? Like I said, it's an issue that's confronting all of humanity, but our tasking here is relative to commercial space. So how do we help fix this problem? I think for the most part, it's pretty evident that spaceports are being impacted by climate change. No surprise there. I think the thing that most people think of immediately is sea level rise, and that's certainly probably the primary issue, but it's much more comprehensive than that, as is the phenomenon of sea level rise. The coasts are being where the attention is primarily focused, but additionally, anything that's increasing storm activity is increasing flood risks. The droughts in the West are of increasing severity that's impacting the threat of wildfires, and access to a reliable aquifer can increasingly become a problem. So I think across the board, regardless of where your spaceport is, this is an issue that's important. I think what we're looking at is trying to suggest that the spaceport launch activity, the infrastructure, and everything associated with what we're trying to do at a spaceport has to date and at present will continue to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. with ad hoc responses of funding to address crises and impacts. And I think what we're looking at is how do we better deal with that? Particularly given the fact that I think everyone in this room certainly is acutely aware of the fact that the spaceport use is going to be increasing and growing exponentially, and the impacts for commercial and civilian exploration, and equally, if not more important, national security imperatives is just going to continue to grow. So I think that's something that gets everybody's attention. Next, next slide, findings, please. So what we were thinking would be the best approach would be to solicit information, request studies, advise the FAA to begin accumulating information on a more comprehensive basis that will enable us to do the long-term maintenance and monitoring and replenishment strategies, so that we have a comprehensive approach to this issue that will help us in mitigating all of the challenges that climate change is confronting us with, particularly in the interest of maintaining the nation's ability to respond and meet the challenges that active and resilient spaceports are going to require of us for both operational, competitive, and secure purposes. I think it's equally important to identify and continue to drive home the fact that spaceports, like airports and seaports and other transportation authorities, are an essential component of American, of what we do in America, and our ability to maintain quality of life, national security imperatives. We just need to be cognizant of that and help to elevate the profile of spaceports in the eyes of the public, and was, as I tried to mention this morning, that then makes it a relevant and issue around which we can gain support within members of Congress and policymakers, equally important, if not more so, appropriators. Next slide, please. So our final recommendations is just that ask the FAA and AST to begin to consider doing independent third-party studies that will enable us to compile data that would be the basis for developing those long-term strategies, so that we can go to the Congress and be able to, in a perfect world, this is a tough challenge, but in a perfect world, can we get a sort of like a separate line item to specifically address how does this industry and this country maintain its spaceports in the face of climate change? Ideally, that would lead to hopefully a wise choice as to who would lead this effort. What are the metrics against which you judge progress? And is there a potential mechanism for a funding source that would be sustainable and make sense? You know, like I said, this will be hard, but I think if we did our job as in a perfect world and in an optimal outcome, we would have a dedicated funding source and a strategy backed up to support that funding source that maintains the spaceports and their resiliency in the face of climate change, whether it's sea level rise and erosion risk, or fires, drought, everything that humanity is presently confronting. And our final recommendation is that it made sense to us that this would be a logical task as a charter of the interagency task force that's been formed to develop the national spaceport strategy. And I'm done. Any questions? Oh, come on.
I have a question. Our spaceport, I know there's discussion of space infrastructure being called critical infrastructure. Are spaceports thought in the same manner? And if so, is there any extra attention on that because of potential impacts due to climate change?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, I don't know if spaceports fall under the definition of critical infrastructure at present. I think there was some concern about whether or not what spaceports and space activities starts being identified as critical, because I think that starts bleeding into the NTSB issue. But I think for purposes of climate change, if we are not there, that's a good question. We should be. I don't know why we wouldn't be, just as a facility designation.
How about airport infrastructure? There's obviously some overlap here with that. Is this a question being asked within the rest of FAA?
I don't know, but it's a good one.
So in regards to critical infrastructure, and I think one of the last bullets on your previous slide was to maybe have this as part of the interagency working group. One of the things with that interagency working group that we are looking at is what happens if spaceports are deemed critical infrastructure. What's that second and third order of effects? Because with that term and with those designations, that invites a whole lot of other things. And before everybody jumps on that bandwagon, we want to know exactly what that is, because it sounds great. And it may be the step that we need to take because it's the right thing to do. But we want to go in and make sure that industry and the interagency working group and everybody understands what those effects are. And, because now you bring in Homeland Security. Now you bring in additional security requirements for spaceports. So, okay, so we want to get all those things and then come back and maybe come back for COMSTAC as well to let industry know, hey, if we go down this path, this is what it is. Make sure that and probably come back to COMSTAC for a, hey, and what is industry's recommendation? Should we pursue this? Or is there something different? Maybe instead of the full critical infrastructure, it is, okay, maybe not that full piece, but maybe there's some other steps that need to be taken. I know that the FAA, in conjunction with Homeland Security and I believe the FBI, are doing some field, I won't say evaluation, but going out to the spaceports and walking through those securities things and coming back with, hey, here's where you may need to increase security and some of those things. I think that's a great first step. The critical infrastructure, yeah, there's a lot more to come on that. And I think that is maybe where we need to go. Maybe.
So my apologies for derailing us a little bit on that question.
No.
But I think there's some overlap there of why, if it's critical infrastructure, then this issue of impact from climate change may need to be elevated. I guess the second question, Jim, is about airports and their interest in this topic as well.
And that's a good question, because some spaceports are, co-located and right with airports. So how would you split that, or how would you make that the same? That's a good question, and you can work on that. Get the information.
Hey, Charity, Chris Hassler.
Go ahead, Chris.
One of the things in this whole area is going to be the propellants, the fuels that are used to launch at all these spaceports. There are a number of people that are concerned that the current propellants and things that we are currently using are contributing to the atmospheric damage. So one of the things that people might want to start getting a running start on is what are the alternatives to the propellants that we're currently using as part of the environmental damage and impact statements these spaceports are going to have to deal with.
I think that gets to, we were trying to keep our response to this tasker narrowed to specifically the impact of climate changes on spaceports, with the understanding that there is another question out there that was mentioned by the Secretary and the Administrator yesterday. But for this tasker, we were trying to keep our response narrow. And your question's well taken, but I think we intentionally did not try to bleed this response into that area.
So maybe to narrow this, you address it as external threats to the current spaceports, and then that does narrow that, and then, oh, by the way, somebody needs to be mindful that there may be licensing requirements that change in the future if you're handling certain propellants. So
Fair enough.
that could become an issue if it's not. And it would be the perfect thing to be studied by multiple agencies. I don't think you would completely want to own this, but I think you would need to be cognizant of what's happening. And oh, by the way, somebody might ask you your opinion on that topic.
Yeah, makes sense. Is Jim, just out of curiosity, do you know, is the charter complete yet on the interagency?
I think we have the final draft, but it hasn't gone through the last
Fair enough.
wicket, so
Okay.
not quite.
Okay. Fair enough.
Would ask one question though, as we're going through this. When you talk about spaceports, critical infrastructure, et cetera, are you specifically aiming and talking about only FAA licensed spaceports? Or are you talking about the single-use places as well becoming critical infrastructure? Or are you narrowing it just to FAA licensed and in that realm?
I'll speak for myself because I'm not sure how Kate or Paul were perceiving this. But I think particularly given the fact that if the recommendation was to suggest that this be a topic of consideration under the interagency, I think that includes all spaceports.
Okay.
And I think at the end of the day, that's what the nation's reliance on spaceports. So federal will obviously be a part of that, but I think the interests of the industry and the nation are better served by all spaceports, subject to disagreement.
Yeah, we were only able to get information on government spaceports, FAA licensed spaceports. So, but I think that's correct. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it for everybody. I just don't know if you'll get the information because the studies we got so far, we haven't gotten all of them. We're only on government spaceports.
I'm done.
We're voting on this item, right?
Yeah,
Yes.
can we bring up the slide again, please, the recommendation page? The recommendation here, Paul, and then do a motion.
So the recommendation here is for a report to be compiled by an independent third party with, at a minimum, DOD, NASA, and NOAA, and other appropriate agencies. And then, of course, there's a few sub-bullets underneath there. Sub-bullet that this should also be incorporated in the interagency task force in development of the national spaceport strategy, it sort of goes back to one of our previous topics. So I think folding this into that effort is pretty.
But
Mike? Do you have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mike. All right, Clay?
Aye.
Dale?
Aye.
Paul?
Aye.
Greg?
aye.
Steve?
Aye.
Kate?
I,
All right. Folks online, Ed Bolton? Ed, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. I'll keep going down the list. Mary Lynn?
Aye.
Chris Hassler?
Yes,
Dale Nash?
Aye.
Sharon Pinkerton? Robbie?
Aye.
Eric?
Yes.
Ann?
Aye.
General Bolton, have you been able to unmute? Still can't hear you if you're speaking. I will vote yes. Charity? Aye. Excellent.
All right, so pull up the next set of charts. And thanks again to Dale Ketchum for not only this task, but always jumping on the task that can seemingly become complex and thorny. And thanks again, Kate, for
It's not just because I take it.
yeah, and thanks to Kate for crossing over to help us out with this one as well. So this is the last tasker for the working groups, and this is for high-speed aerospace transportation systems. So this is the task, and really just to paraphrase, is that these systems, what we're, I think, generally accepting as high-speed aerospace transportation, or HSAT systems, are systems that are really looking at the end of the day, looking at high-speed point-to-point, going from one point on the Earth to another. Some of these are flown through the atmosphere. Some of them are flown through space. Some of them go in between the atmosphere and space. They are going to be subject to integration within the National Aerospace System. And then at least at first, these systems are going to be operating out of FAA licensed spaceport. But the goal is to eventually open that up to traditional airports, as we'll see here in some of the discussion that we had. Next slide, please. So our discussion really surrounded just 4 broad areas, and that's operational considerations, airspace considerations, spaceport considerations. And we did touch a little bit on, we hadn't from the outset, hadn't really thought about touching on the climate impact piece, but it sort of percolated up in some of the conversations, and it dovetailed off nicely off of our other task. We did do a sort of an initial deep dive in some of these areas, but we really look at this as the start of an effort that needs to be done in no small part because these systems are coming online, they're moving fast, they're going to be here within the decade, some of them sooner. And we really want to make sure that the systems are not slowed down by any kind of regulatory considerations or lack thereof. So it really is a trying to prevent the technology from outpacing the regulatory environment. So what you'll see here is really just kind of some wave tops of some what can turn out to be some complex issues and con-ops. Next slide, please. So I won't read this, but just to paraphrase, this is some information that was provided. Both of these quotes came from the Global Spaceport Alliance. But really the takeaway is that the US government should establish a goal of leading the world in point-to-point transportation through space, be a major game changer for both national security and economic competitiveness. There should be a part that the FAA AST plays in near-term discussions with not only the providers, but some of our international partners. And Dr. Neal made the recommendation at our fall 2020 COMSTAC meeting that a study should be initiated specifically to identify some pre-approved corridors and trajectories where these systems can be developed and tested. Next slide, please. Going further into the discussion, so we reached out to a number of companies that we know are developing these systems. I know that there's a lot that are still in stealth at this time. We also did a sort of dovetailed off of our field trip out there to Warrington, where we talked to Dwayne Freer and his team. We talked specifically about the Space Data Integrator and how some of these systems will integrate, and how they're looking at Class Echo Aerospace, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in just a moment. But we did engage with a lot of the SMEs and a lot of the companies and got a great deal of feedback. So it really should be noted that what we're talking about with high speed here is not supersonic, which is really going to be regulated by big FAA. We're still talking about AST stuff. So this is space vehicles that may be considered suborbital or maybe considered orbital, but are being used for very long range point to point, going from one point of the Earth, maybe a half rev all the way. And what ends up happening is sometimes the lines get blurred as to what these vehicles are. Should they be regulated by FAA? Should they be regulated by AST? But again, there will be aspects of National Aerospace Integration, spaceports, and the future regulatory process. Again, at the end of the day, the goal is to make this as flexible as possible and ensure the development is not impeded. Next slide, please. So going into some observations, there really is a spectrum of systems that are currently in development. And as I said, some of these could fly within the decade and some even sooner. These broad categories are not all inclusive, but they're very general categories. You have air-breathing endo-atmospheric, i.e. Vehicles that fly within the atmosphere and are air-breathing, i.e. jet, ramjet, scramjet. Non-air-breathing endo-atmospheric, yes, there are some of those, which are really essentially rocket boost glide systems, which will be in the upper atmosphere, but are non-air-breathing. And then, of course, you have orbital and other exo-atmospheric systems. The rocket cargo program that Transcom has put together is a good example of that. And then there's others. And I think there's going to be a whole range of things that fall into the others. Transatmospheric, something that may skip off of the atmosphere, go exo-atmospheric, come back down, get a scoop of air for the scramjet, and then go back exo-atmospheric. I think it was a company in Australia use the term scramjet skip, which I think is a pretty novel concept. So as far as the architectures, there's many architectures. Most of them fall under horizontal takeoff and landing, vertical takeoff and landing, but there are air-launched systems that are looking at point-to-point ConOps. And there's at least one system out there that's using a novel rail system, and that's Radian Aerospace. Now they're being designed as an orbital vehicle, but they do have some thoughts about how they might do hypersonic testing or eventually high-speed point-to-point transportation. Again, the goal is to get to high-performance, highly energetic systems, including rocket-based, but with eventual jet-like reliability and aircraft-like operations. This has really been the holy grail of this community for some time. It was really made abundantly clear that the companies don't want to address these issues alone. They are somewhat stovepiped at this point, but they really do when it comes to the regulatory environment. They really do want to get the support of FAA, both AST and non-AST. Next slide, please. So right now, companies are, as you would expect, seeking the most permissive flight environments possible. They don't want to have too many rigid things placed upon them from the outset. They want to have a creation of an integrated environment where vehicles seamlessly operate. And we'll touch on this a little bit in a subsequent slide, but it was strongly recommended. There's a desire for more flexibility in the upper Class E and above the NAS. So when we talk about Class E, we're talking about flight level 600, 60,000 feet and above. See that on the next slide. I put this in quotes because somebody used this term of space flight rules. We're all used to visual flight rules, VFR, instrument flight rules, IFR. somebody put out the term space flight rules for exoatmospheric operations. Okay, perhaps that's a future set of flight rules that's developed. But again, it needs to blend seamlessly into existing protocols and procedures. That includes separation rules, handling, arrival, departure procedures. All of those things need to be addressed. It was suggested that perhaps we look into some analogs of what's going on right now with autonomous flight rule or AFR development. I wasn't really aware of that until I looked into it a little bit. And it's really, aircraft now have the ability to do self-separation with utilizing ADS-B and TCAS and things. So that's an ongoing FAA effort right now. So there was some talk about possibly using those analogs. The goal again is to file and fly, and rather than making a stretch of file and fly like commercial airlines, they said we'd like to file and fly with rules similar to supersonic aircraft under existing FAA regulations. So another point was that eventually they want to get to certified space transiting systems that can operate from any airport. And it was also noted that some of the VTOL guys want to be able to operate out of any heliport. So you're talking about rocket-based systems that want to land at a heliport. So these guys are really, really aspirational. Next slide, please. So we mentioned Class E, and it was pointed out to us that there is an ongoing effort right now to look at procedures in high altitude, again, above 60,000 feet. These are high altitude aircraft, stratospheric balloons, but really 60,000 feet up to whatever we decide today is considered space. So that work is ongoing right now with FAA and NASA, the Next Gen Upper Class E Traffic Management or ETM effort, and they're putting together an ETM proposed CONOPS. So what was noted by the group that we talked to, endo-atmospheric systems operating in the upper Class E, so basically still within the atmosphere, should operate under a cooperative separation model as proposed in the Next Gen ETM CONOPS. So I think that is really where they're drawing back from that autonomous flight rules analogy. Next slide. So some observations, continuing on there for spaceports. Spaceports preferred initially, but again, they want to be able to operate in traditional airports and heliports for vertical takeoff systems. It was made clear that non-space transiting systems would prefer to be regulated under Part 91 and to operate out of those airports from the start. There was one company in particular that's very, very adamant about that. This is the other real major takeaway of this, is that airspace corridors need to be developed, and specifically overland airspace corridors for the development, testing, and initial operations. That's critical for these operations. The environmental reviews, as we talked about a little bit on the climate change side of things, those environmental impacts at spaceports could be done through some of the existing work. So maybe folding into the previous task that we talked about. But it's key to note that there will eventually have to be a global approach to the environmental review, because of course, if you're doing half rev point to point, you're going from one point of the Earth to the other, there may be a more or less restrictive environmental regime from your departure or your arrival location. Next slide, please. So going into some of the findings, we have 2 findings and 2 recommendations matched each of those findings. A strategic effort is needed in the near term to roadmap smooth introduction of these systems within the next decade. It was encouraged that we really should look at this as a systems engineering challenge. It needs to be interagency, but eventually the international partners need to be brought in as well. And again, the goal is to avoid the friction points and roadblocks, bureaucratic friction, to again, let the technology move at the pace that it's moving right now. We don't need to focus too much on specific architectures at this time. So AST's role in this doesn't necessarily need to be in charge. And I think in a lot of things that we've talked about as we really dilute this down, it may not be AST's role at the end of the day for a lot of these systems. It may fall into other places within FAA. But AST can still play that role of encourage and facilitate. We shouldn't cede that designated advocacy role for systems that are transiting through space. We don't need to solve everything today, but the time horizon can't be open-ended, and I think you'll see that in the recommendation. The next finding, next slide, please. As I said, designated overland flight corridors need to be established for the development, testing, and initial ops of these systems. Now, there are several efforts that are underway. There's a existing corridor in Kansas. I know that some folks up around Washington, Idaho area are looking at some east to west corridors. And Midland is making some progress with studying a number of corridors, the most prominent of which is north of the Midland Air and Spaceport that terminates into the White Sands missile range. The approvals and the establishment of those corridors need to happen as soon as possible, so that when these systems come online, they have a place to test overland. Now, this last bullet here, it was, again, strongly encouraged that there's a relaxation in overland flight restrictions for supersonic flight within these corridors. This probably obviously doesn't fall within the purview of AST, but again, it's sort of this larger mosaic of things that need to happen. The quote that I took away, I wrote down verbatim, one of the folks running one of these companies said the open flight rules may have made sense when they were made, but they don't with today's technology. So moving into the recommendations, next slide. And I'll just read these so we can vote on these. Strategic roadmap, AST should facilitate the initiation of an interagency effort to explore high-speed aerospace transportation systems, their development, integration into the national airspace system, and eventual certification. The effort should be coordinated closely with next-gen upper class E traffic management effort. And dedicated working group should be formed and a strategic roadmap completed no later than the end of FY 2023. So it basically gives about a year and a half to come up with a resulting strategic roadmap. The second recommendation has to do with the high-speed aerospace corridors. Working with the appropriate FAA and other state, local, federal entities, AST should help facilitate and promote the development of these designated corridors for the development, testing, and eventual operations of HSAT systems. And then, of course, the supersonic piece, as a follow-on to the 2020 Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, FAA should accelerate the issuance of new noise certification standards for supersonic overland flight. That is what we have on this topic. I'll open it up for discussion. I think we have discussion already.
Hey, this is Chris Osler. I got three things. I'm sorry I wasn't available to participate in some of this early, so I feel a little guilty bringing this up at this date. But there's three interesting things here. The high-speed corridors, at what altitude would you specify those? Because they would possibly cut across, bisect existing corridors that we have going east-west for commercial aircraft. Would you be specifying those at a particular altitude so that you would have proper separation? That's a question, and you can kind of bundle these together and not have to do them sequentially. The other thing is we've already been landing lifting bodies, Boeing in particular, at Canaveral. Okay, there's designated runways set aside for these things. They've gone into orbit. They've gone around the Earth a number of times. Sensitive, I think, on how long that's happened. But then they've come in and they've landed as a lifting body. You can think mini space shuttle at Canaveral, and that's already happened on several occasions. A lot of it is unclassified, and you can look it up on the internet. But there's a runway set aside for that. And what's unique about that is they're landing in an East Coast high density area. And so there has to be some kind of adjudication for them to make that kind of landing out of orbit, okay? But what's really significant, what I didn't see mentioned here, is I believe they were all autonomous vehicles as well. So you have autonomous vehicle activity, you have what altitude or the supersonic routes intended to be. And I think that will make a big difference on how the FAA would treat that. And I think the fact that autonomy was only discussed in terms of flight rules towards the end of the presentation. Some of these cargo lifters are going to be autonomous vehicles. And I think we need to anticipate that.
So I'll try to answer those in no particular order, but I guess to kind of start with the ultimate vision of this is if you are doing point to point for commerce, that means you're likely initially doing some sort of cargo flights over very long distances in very short time periods, and then eventually getting to passenger service. Those are going to have to be very regularly scheduled, very high ops tempo, and with that, not disruptive to the existing operations. So I would say that, if we look at glide entry bodies like the space shuttle, those were usually pretty one-off events. And it was a very discrete flight path that was flown, and we were able to do deconfliction. But if you're doing these things, multiple times a day or multiple times an hour, like regularly scheduled flights, it's going to have some sort of seamless integration there. I think we really just touched on it. Like I said, this is just kind of wave tops. I think there's a lot more work that has to be done downstream of this. And I asked Wayne Freer this. I said, thinking way ahead, do you think the FAA is going to design entry corridors from something that's flying from Tokyo and entering and landing in New York? Is there going to be a box that they have to come in? Or is the company going to tell you, this is how we fly our flight path? Because some of them may be gliders, some of them may be powered. I would think that eventually you'd want to have some sort of a go-around capability. So again, it becomes less of a one-off, and it has to be something that's seamlessly integrated. As far as the altitude of the corridors, I think these guys are all considering very high altitude for these corridors, probably above 60,000 feet. I know the one at Midland is something like 35 miles wide by 320 miles east-west, because they want to do hypersonic testing. You eat up that 320 miles pretty quickly. But I think it's definitely going to be up in the Class E airspace, Chris. Did that answer some of the questions?
I think
I know there's a lot more questions than answers at this point.
Yeah, I think the altitude is Class E is important. You might want to associate that with that graphic that you have, because you could show in that graphic that it would then fall in to something above 60,000 feet, and that would require, additional interest and some changes to how FAA does things right now. But the other thing is the emphasis on autonomous vehicle. I think there's a couple places where we could add that terminology in there earlier on in some of the slides, so that when you're looking at these speeds and these altitudes, there's very good probability that what we're really talking about is autonomous control.
I could see that being the case. It's kind of in reverse, I think, where you could probably do a fully autonomous vehicle if it was cargo only. But let's fast forward to say that you have a system that's certified to fly passengers and people are paying to go from New York to Tokyo. I guess to turn
Yeah, I
the
agree with
around,
you.
if we have autonomous commercial airliners at that point, then maybe we'd have autonomous high
I
speed.
think
systems.
I
But
think
don't
it's a
that's
two-stage
full autonomy.
event. I
Sorry,
think I think they'll start with autonomous cargo and prove out their algorithms and everything because of risk management before they move on
Yeah.
to manned high-speed.
and that all comes back to talking about any kind of an autonomous system that's operating within the national airspace. That's going to be a broader discussion.
I guess I'd add, supersonic corridors. I think the primary concern is going to be noise.
Yeah.
Always noise. Some folks out there are trying to figure out how to go supersonic through the use of weather to avoid shocks hitting the ground.
Yeah.
I think all that stuff's going to be pretty high. Jet routes go to 45 right now. So I think the corridor is going to have to be designated, primarily looking at noise, assuming the shock's going to hit the ground. Current technology for lifting bodies, space vehicles, at least right now, I'm not suggesting this in the future, right now, there's a tendency to think of those trajectories to be like airplane trajectories, and they're totally not. They're very vertical.
Yeah.
You hit, when you're 12 miles from your landing site, you're well over 50,000 feet. And so you got to think about vertical penetration of airspace as opposed to horizontal. Now in the future, with hypersonic vehicles going point to point, that may not be the case, but they're still going to be way above the 60,000 feet, or it's just not practical.
And we had different providers that, one of which said that their ConOps is really their vertical takeoff, vertical landing, is that they're going to be vertical. They're just going to punch up through the airspace and then, depress the trajectory.
Yeah.
But others are going to be, so again, there's not that one size fits all, but these guys got to figure out how they're going to integrate with the existing system, because the system probably isn't going to adapt to them too easily.
No, it's the point I'm trying to make is the trajectories are so different than aircraft.
Yeah.
You got to think about it differently.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing.
Hey, on that point, I agree with that completely. I think we have Boeing representation here, and I think two of the last lifting bodies that were in orbit and then autonomously landed at Canaveral were Boeing's vehicles. Somebody should bring Boeing into this discussion.
That's BX-37, so, but I think that is, predicated on flying a lot like we did shuttle. So there was, a huge precedent, set for that, for the use of the airspace and how you integrate. And, with 400 or 500 day missions, I don't think we're really taxing the system. It's kind of a one-off that's, hopefully you get more than a couple hours notice that they're coming in.
Yeah.
Okay, good point.
Government work.
Paul, you mentioned an Australian outfit designing some tech for this. Can you give us an idea of the trends globally of how this tech is being developed outside the US?
Yeah, Australia is interesting. They just seem to over the last few decades have had a lot of technical and a lot of R&D down there. And I've never really pulled on that thread too much, but I assume because Australia is pretty remote from the rest of the world. So that's probably the motivation as to why they've kind of built this brain trust down there. But I think that was a company called Hypersonics with an X. There is a European company, I think called Destinus, that's talking about Mach 5 plus, a whole range of them within the US. And then, of course, there's a few players that are trying to go after the Transcom rocket cargo here in the US.
Question runs through my mind, Steve. You brought up a good point to say that it's more vertical penetration.
Yeah.
And some of your descriptions make it seem like it's more, hypersonic at, 60,000 feet flat and level.
Yeah.
I think, at some point we will probably be there. I don't know if it's, in the foreseeable future. I just don't, I would say what you're looking to do is try to, integrate in for some of this vehicle testing right now.
Right.
I think that, we've kind of done some of that, I think with Starliner, as far as, coming in for, kind of a controlled reentry, and then finally with, chutes coming down the last, few thousand feet. But that's, a very predictable type of trajectory, and I don't know if that's what you're looking at. And then my other question is, if you're looking for, just high-speed transport at the flat level, at those kind of speeds, are these corridors going to be enough? I mean, at some point, you're going to have to decelerate and get out of it. And,
Yeah, really, the core, it should really be clear that the high-speed corridor piece in the recommendation is really in the near term, so that these folks have a place to do tests. But, again, at some point, someone's going to build a business case, fly from point X to point Y on the other side of the world, and they're going to have a technology and a ConOps that may not easily integrate with the existing airspace. And like you said, I mean, if it's vertical, then there's going to be a small chunk of airspace where they have to deconflict with others.
I mean, supersonic corridors, I used to do FCS and do Mach 2 runs. And we had a supersonic corridor we used in Texas to do that. So I assume those still happen.
These guys are talking about doing Mach 5 stuff. Like you said,
Mach 5
the boom is going to be a challenge.
But I mean, even at, I would do runs at 40,000 feet where there's booms everywhere, where we would track start and end. It was a designated corridor with a certain width. And I don't know if that was this years ago. I don't know if that was approved through the FAA or just something. Got it. It wasn't in a MOA or anything. It was a corridor.
There's a few of those out there.
Yeah.
But what these corridors, they're trying to go a lot faster. So obviously they're going to have to go a lot higher.
It's a different category.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate the acknowledgement of the existing efforts going on in other parts of FAA, since a lot of this is about airspace. Particularly with the existing work going on the high altitude integration, as well as quite a bit of work going on supersonic already. So I just think it's really important, just a kudos, but also as far as our recommendations, for me at least, it's important that we're acknowledging these ongoing efforts. We're not trying to create a new work stream sort of on top of or to replace those efforts.
Right.
And there's a lot of energy already going on for those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other discussion on this? Could we have the slide of the recommendation back up, please?
And while they're bringing the slide up, I do have a question, more of a rhetorical question though. As we go forward, one of your observations was that spaceports are preferred initially. The space transiting systems will eventually operate out of any airport or heliport. At what point do we say it's safe enough to land one of those vehicles? And I'm going to be far-fetched and just using this as a point, for one of those vehicles to land on top of this building in downtown New York that has a helipad.
I think so.
Yeah, so even backing that up, at what point, what's the thinking? Okay, maybe not a spaceport, but that airport. How many flights? Is it 1,000 flights? Is it 100 flights? What is there any thought process as to when we'll have enough safety data to with assurance say, hey, you're transiting space, but you can land at Dulles Airport. That's great. I think that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about. because right now, you know, one of the things that I've been told, oh, we need 1,000 flights.
Yeah.
Okay.
We need more than that.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. And that's kind of my point. That piece is great aspirational. Is that 20 years from now? Is that 5 years from now? What's the thinking about the timeline? When are we going to get there to where even that becomes, hey, you know, we should think about this now?
So one of the bullets that I had on a previous slide was almost verbatim from one of the, I'll call him a graybeard, who started one of these companies. He eventually wants to get to a high performance, highly energetic system, including rocket based, with eventual jet-like reliability and aircraft-like operations, which you kind of looked as like a mismatch between jet and rocket. But in his mind, he thinks that rocket reliability can be as reliable or more reliable than jet engines. When you just look at he looks at it as a parts count. There's dramatically order of magnitude less parts in a rocket engine. But I think we'll all attest from experience that rockets are a little less reliable than gas turbine engines that probably have billions of hours of flight time on them right now.
Right.
So that's at least one voice in this group with whom we engaged as to what their aspirational goals are.
Jim, I've seen some concepts where you have a heliport and people board into a craft that then flies to the spaceport and integrates without even getting out of the vehicle. That helicraft incorporates into a point-to-point system and then flies, and then same thing on the other side, because as you say, like taking off for some of these systems, you need to be far outside an urban area. The problem is transit time, right? If you're offshore or wherever you're located for the spaceport, you literally would get, but not move, right? Once you get into this system that actually has, vertical takeoff capability, and then that system just incorporates into a rocket body, basically, then takes off and then re-enters and does the same thing, so that you speed transport. You don't miss any of you're overcoming all this time and distance issue, right?
Right.
So then you make that even simpler for people that would want to do that kind of travel. Super clever.
If there's no other discussion, let's hear a motion to recommend. Maybe you want to review the recommendations again just quickly and then.
Sure. So two recommendations: strategic roadmap, really starting the conversation to explore some of the unique systems, some of these systems that sort of blur the lines. It should be closely coordinated, Mike, to your point, with the next gen upper classy traffic management effort. So there's no duplication of effort there. It should be time bound so that it's complete by the end of FY 2023. So that would be the end of September of 2022. I'm sorry, September of 2023. So about a year and a half from now. And then the other recommendation has to do with the high speed aerospace corridors. Those are in the near term to allow for overland testing of beyond supersonic into the hypersonic domain. And then again, the last bullet there, I think, is probably outside of AST's purview, but a relaxation of some of those supersonic overflight rules. So that's good.
This is Chris again. On the recommendations under strategic roadmap, would it be possible in the second bullet, this effort should be considered closely with the next gen upper class E traffic management effort for both autonomous and manned vehicles? Is that an appropriate addition?
Suspect it could be brought into the consideration. I'll just say that it wasn't really included because none of the folks we talked to really made that distinction. I think the assumption was that these would be, certainly when they're passenger carrying configurations, that they would be crewed vehicles. So I mean, it's worth looking into, but there wasn't a distinction made. I don't think in those conversations.
to leave that to the group, but you know, I think they will be of slightly different designs. I think the emphasis on safety will probably be less on cargo than on manned. And then how it transits through other airspace could be different as well.
Sure.
And Chris, not to not to try to presume solutions, right? But I think it's the concept of that takeoff and landing transition through what is a highly trafficked national airspace area. It doesn't probably much matter whether it's crewed or uncrewed, right? Because you're coming in on the terminuses are in that high traffic area. Which is why they probably haven't really been.
Well, yeah, and the takeoff, likely.
And I think as a result of that, to your point, Mike, the safety requirements are going to be the same or maybe even higher for an uncrewed vehicle.
Yeah, probably.
So.
I think you made a motion.
Yes, motion to
Second.
approve the recommendation.
Second.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Bill?
I'd say, yes, I'd like to see, strategic road. I don't know if you can come up with an explicit, but I'm thinking strategic options, something along that line. To say, what are the options we should be considering right now, rather than trying to drive to a single strategic
analysis.
Yeah. I think, let's keep it at a higher level. I think some of us are struggling to get our arms around this right now and saying, what is it we're really trying to drive to? And I think I like the first part about it, to where it says explore these high-speed transportation systems. I would like to, look at, what are the options, and kind of what are the timing of the options for those. What do we need now? What do we think we need in, a second phase and a third phase? Sure. And say that kind of sets more of the horizon time frame for you for what answers you need, what time frame you need it. I think it gives you a broader framework to say what's important now and what's important.
I like that a lot, just for an unsolicited vote, because previously we established a nice precedent of prioritizing things in the order which we thought things were most important. And I think we could do that here as well.
So with that change from strategic roadmap to strategic analysis.
Need to take out the procedure rule book here for a second.
Okay,
So I move to approve the recommendations with that change.
Okay, great.
Agree.
Excellent.
Robert's Rules of Order.
So Bill, your vote is yes.
Yes.
Mike French?
Yes, as amended.
Dale?
Yes.
Paul?
Aye.
Greg?
Aye.
Steve?
Aye.
You made the second, right, Jenny?
Aye.
Thank you. Going online, we may have lost General Bolton. General Bolton, are you with us? Mary Lynn?
As amended, aye.
Thank you. Chris Hassler? Chris?
He was there. There you go.
Okay, are you there?
Yes?
Yeah, my screen didn't say that. Okay, as amended, yes.
Thank you so much. Dale Nash?
Aye.
Robbie?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
And Anne voted yes just a moment ago. She had to drop off. I vote yes. Chair? Aye. Excellent. Thank you so much. Passes. Real quick before we move on, we had a question come in for the INI working group. Could I ask that briefly? Okay. This is with respect to spaceports from the last tasker. What critical supply chain aspects impact spaceports' infrastructure readiness and availability to support all phases of spaceports resilience during, lost it, sorry.
Increased national needs.
Can you read it?
Yeah, increased national needs, i.e. launch surge capacity and constellation replenishment on demand.
Beginning of it, say that
So
again.
basically, it's asking about supply chain. What are the critical supply chain aspects that could be impacting spaceport infrastructure?
Helium.
Helium.
Yeah.
Number one.
We're learning about LOX and GN2 right now as well.
Well, it's outside the purview of the tasker, I think, but I think in terms of supply chain, I would agree helium is a rather unique challenge. But that's a fair question, but I'm not sure it applies to that particular task. It's a good question.
It came in as we were discussing the last tasker.
Helium's been a problem for decades, but it's getting more acute now with conflict in the world and the diminishing supplies. And I know in my 2 employers ago, we were trying to figure out how to recapture helium because of the cost involved. And it's a huge challenge.
Is it an AST issue? Do we have to tie it back to safety, or is this more about promoting future market growth and making sure that, you know, our fundamental ground infrastructure is ready to step up to some of these big challenges we've got coming?
Thanks. And I don't know, Charity, you want to keep moving forward through the agenda?
Unless there are any dissents for keep pressing through, we're ahead of the game here, so I can anticipate us ending early. So yeah, keep going. All right, let's do that. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Lee, who's not here, that has helped champion these incredibly difficult but important tasks. Also want to thank Dale and Kate for contributing to this IIWG task on climate change. Thank you, and all good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up, Jim, is you? Okay.
Yes. All right. So this is the ambulance standing between people and going home. Oh, boy. All right. Well, good. All right. So a while back, I sent out some questions on standards, and this is in regards to our couple reports due to Congress. I'll talk about all the reports and kind of give an update on where we are in all those, because I just had some great breaking news on one of them, which I'm very excited to say, but I'll hold that. So, exactly, leave you hanging, the cliffhanger. But we've asked Aerospace to help us with the one report on the framework and that piece. And part of that framework deals with standards and industry acceptance, et cetera. So I know I sent out to everybody, and if you had a chance to read them, great. Some of the questions were not really COMSTAC questions. So I sent them to ASTM. I have their answers, and we'll go through their answers so you get that feeling from ASTM where they are and they're thinking on some of these standards. And then there's some other questions that are definitely COMSTAC. So what I'd like to do is have a discussion. This is not an official tasker to COMSTAC, but since we're all together, want to have that initial discussion, and then these will be tasked out to the next COMSTAC to come up with, more formal answers. But in that interim, kind of get your thinking. There's going to be no vote, any of that, but just your kind of findings, observations, recommendations, kind of off the cuff if you haven't read the answers. So next slide, please. Again, these are from ASTM, and Andrew Nelson is also on the phone. So if there are questions or we want to ask him something, or if he wants to chime in, Andrew, please feel free to do so. Are there any voluntary industry consensus standards on human spaceflight safety that have been accepted by the industry at large? ASTM has said currently have 6 published standards that are approved by industry experts, i.e. they have gone through the ASTM process like Andrew briefed earlier this morning. Next slide. These are the 6. And again, I won't read through them. But these are the 6. And then next slide. How are they being implemented? How much are they being used? If use is minimal, what is preventing broader acceptance? This is one probably that will be coming back around and why the ASTM to answer if they had any good knowledge. This is probably one that will be coming back around and coming to COMSTAC. Are any of them being implemented or used or even considered? I think the next step would be, are any of them being considered to be implemented and used? All right, next slide, please. What voluntary industry consensus standards are currently being worked on? And again, Andrew presented a lot of these earlier. And ASTM and ISO standards development spreadsheet below. In addition to the 6 already approved, there's 9 more that are being developed. All right, the next slide. Are there any areas that are currently not worked on but should be for that initial set of standards for safety framework? And again, this is one I asked ASTM to give us the answer. This one's coming back around for industry, COMSTAC, to look at and provide recommendation, advice, and observations on as well. F47 is a roadmap to organize the highest priority safety standards as they see it, and as industry is working with ASTM to do this.
Yeah, Jim, I could add one point to this was in my earlier presentation. I mentioned that we had gone through the original human spaceflight recommended characteristics that AST had put together, and then we also mapped into it the commercial crew performance-based requirements from NASA, and sort of did that overlay and framework, and then have been keeping track of that and for making sure that all of those different requirements are somehow being addressed in the 4 or 5 standards that are being developed now. So I can let the committee know about that.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
All right, and then next slide, please. When will a complete set of accepted standards be ready for safety framework? Well, that's a tough one, and I absolutely agree with what the ASTM came back with and said, hey, standards work is never done. It's an ongoing thing, and as Andrew mentioned in his briefing, those standards are never set in concrete and set aside. They're reviewed every 4 years or so, and make sure that they're up to date. But again, you know, one of the things out there, what is the right number of accepted standards to be ready for safety framework? Is it the 6? Is it 9 more? Is it 30 standards? What's that number? When is that? And that's again a really tough question that is going to take a good deal of thinking and thought. All right. Next slide, please. Are there any stakeholders who are not currently involved but should be? And this is going to be one of those plugs out there for people in, I was going to say TV land, but out there on YouTube, they're looking, as well as all the COMSTAC members as well. If you are not involved, it's one of those, if you aren't involved, don't complain, but please get involved. This is your opportunity to get involved. And I'll also make this disclaimer. The FAA and AST is not saying that ASTM is the only standards development organization in the world and everything has to go through them. But this is a great opportunity. They are doing a lot of this heavy lifting for here in the US. And as I have explained, and mentioned, not really explained, but mentioned to ASTM in the executive meeting, that you aren't just setting American standards. This is actually international standards, because if an American launch operator is launching from New Zealand, they have a US license. And so if they're using an ASTM standard as a means of compliance, flying out of New Zealand, you're now international standards. So this is big, and as we have seen with a couple foreign countries, their regulations on launch and re-entry are looking amazingly like Part 450. In fact, we just had a country ask, hey, could we just translate your 450 into our language and change a few words for offices and that? And we said, absolutely. And we'll also work with you to say, hey, here's some places where you might want to make it a little bit better and clear. But the world is starting to do that. So again, standards can go around the world. All right, next, please. So here we get into more of where I'd like to get some discussion from you all, and not just here in the room, but obviously out there in Zoom land and on YouTube. Are there any changes to the recommended list from COMSTAC in 2014? And I apologize, I just now realized I didn't put those recommendations in this slide. Boy, that was bad on my part, and I apologize. So it's a little hard to say, are there any changes to the list that you may not recall in 2014? Because I don't remember the list, and I read through it much more recently than 2014. But as a thought process, this will be coming back around. So if you do, and I will send that list out to everybody here, and certainly will solicit your inputs. And then this, again, like I said, this will be a task for the next COMSTAC as well. Next. Please provide any recommendations and observations on the status of recent industry readiness indicators, including assessment of current and near-term projection of space flights, participants for adventure, occupation, and/or transportation. What is the extent of international operations and competition? So I will pause here, and any discussion or thoughts?
What does occupation refer to there? Venture, I get. Is that like professional?
Professional, maybe, right?
Yeah, that's my.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting choice of word, but okay.
I would look at that as, adventure. Hey, I'm going up, exactly what you would think of adventure, transportation point to point,
right.
Occupation. Hey, I'm going to go up to that commercial space station and do some research, et cetera, and then come back. So that occupational.
The work.
We're
Yeah.
going to go for work.
Okay.
It's coming. I mean,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can see
That's
the
our
medical
goal.
community say, hey, your job is to go
Yeah.
up.
Well, it's like the suborbital crew
Yes.
program, right? Which is not just, in fact, the
Right.
professional astronauts have eschewed that program. They don't want to do it, which I think is a bad choice. But I think they're going to get there. Otherwise, it's going to take them a little bit. But anybody with a NASA badge or anybody from a government badge that wants to do research in orbit could go fly, right? So
Right.
Occupation. All right, I get it.
So Jim, are you looking for input on, do we feel that we met all those indicators as part of the evaluation for our standards healthy enough, or?
Well, met, because we said these are the readiness indicators. Boom. So where are we with the current and near-term projection of space flights with those three categories? Do we have them? and not putting words in people's mouths, but I think we all see that kind of the adventure tourism piece, we have people doing that. Occupation, maybe not as much. Maybe we haven't met that indicator. And I said I wasn't going to put words in your mouth, but now here I am. And then transportation, I'm not sure we've gotten there yet.
That's gonna be a bit.
So that's sorry for I'm making a bad school teacher. I'm giving the answers to what I'm asking. This is not good.
I think what you said is good, yeah.
We agree.
I didn't go back.
Advertising, is that an occupation?
Advertising?
Media.
I don't know.
I would think so. You know, if media people are going,
Michael Strahan flying on New Shepard is occupational flight.
I think you're on the cusp of that, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
you got
we're on the
Alan,
cusp of that readiness.
you
We're
got-
starting to dabble in it.
Alan Stern signed up to do some research on the flight.
Yeah. I mean, it's not yet a full-time occupation, right? But it is, can be part of your current.
But if you're an actor, that's an occupation, I guess.
are you flying as part of that
This is
acting,
pleasure business, right?
you know, and you know, they have talked about doing movies in space and boxing in space, making those commercials in space, newscasting from space. I mean, you know, it's
Boxing?
So I think this is one of those that.
crazy. I'm like, well, I want paid to see that one. I will pay, not the 25 million. And yeah, MMA.
I'm pretty sure the movie part's lined up and we've got some science researchers who are going. So I think we're there with occupation or it's coming in the next year.
So Jim, I think this is one that's like it's the double-edged sword, right? Is we see the bones of it starting, right? But does that mean it's mature enough to then start taking that and writing down, that's exactly how it will be? I don't think we're there yet, right? The toe's just dipping in the water for things like occupation, right?
I would also argue that adventure, occupation, and transportation is too narrow.
Also,
Okay.
Commercial space flight. We're trying to project, those are the indicators. The indicators may be other things besides that.
I think there's a list of
It's a lot.
what, 5 or 6 indicators that were put out in that report. So I didn't include all of them here. I just picked out a couple of them.
Were you trying to limit it or
For this discussion, just kind of capture a few of these. When it comes back out, I'll give the full list of what had been.
And Jim, just for context, right? If I remember right, this was what was tied to, are the voluntary standards mature enough
Yes,
to become a framework?
correct.
You have to meet these indicators to declare the standards are regular. And that's where this is like the cart before the horse kind of thing is just because maybe we're starting to do that doesn't mean the standards are there. Right? Just because you have the standards doesn't mean you're ready to do it. Right?
Correct.
That's why it's really hard to judge the answer as a yes or a no.
And somebody just reminded me, Mike L.A. was up there being paid to do his job, right? Up during the ASTM
Yes.
work up there.
So I mean, my question was, are you trying to limit the things around which we're attempting to establish whether or not should be doing standards, or are you trying to capture the whole human enterprise of what we're going, because we don't know what we're going to be doing up there in the future? Are you trying to limit it to things around which we could apply standards now?
I would say no. This is what had been established. So if there are other things that need to be added, absolutely, and those other
The whole
pieces.
human enterprise in space.
Sure. But you know, if we put in participants in the whole human, you know, piece, people are going to say, well, what does that mean? What are those things? Is it absolutely everything? Because when you get absolutely everything,
That's true.
you're
Humans are a weird species, so, okay.
right.
fair enough.
Yeah, it'll be a never ending.
Okay.
Well, I can add one more grain of sand to that.
What about looking at, saying industry? So, you know, I put that in context to say right now there's contracts for commercial LEO destinations. Right now, it looks good on paper. I don't know what it's going to look like 2 years, or, are all those providers going to continue to move forward? Will some, step down? I don't know. Is that more of the type of industry indicator that you're looking at to say, do we have the fundamental capabilities to encourage and sustain this projected growth? Maybe launch vehicles are, another one that a couple of years ago, we didn't have, a Falcon. We didn't have, an inkling that we needed a Vulcan and perhaps a new blend. So are those the industry indicators? To me, that it seems like more of a concrete thing than, the number and the types of different space flight passengers, and say, are there going to be the host systems there to enable that growth?
Okay.
Amazon just built about $10 billion worth of launches, so I think the vehicles will be there.
Yeah. All right. Any additional comments on this slide? We only have a few more to go, and I appreciate your time on this. Next slide, then. Please provide any recommendations and observations on the industry's progress in developing safety framework indicators, including the following 4.
So this one's interesting, right? We keep running up against this comparison back to aviation that there was just a thing I was watching on YouTube last night that talked about, the 2010s had no American aviation accidents, and the hang was voluntary safety reporting is what led to that, right? But it just does not directly translate to the current variety of space flight systems, right? Is the way one person flies my Spaceship Two does not at all relate to how they're flying a Dream Chaser or a Dragon I can go report all the issues I found, and they're not at all applicable to anybody else. So the fact that we're not voluntarily sharing that is viewed as a bad thing, right? But yet it has no relevance. So we've been struggling, right? As COMSTAC and with ASTM and standards organizations, all of us have been doing this for years to try to find what are the common things you could share. And there's really not much, right? Ground systems handling, that kind of stuff, sure. Right? But other than that, it gets roadblocked. And one of my worries here is that this looks like we are failing to do what aviation does when it is a bad analogy to start with.
Again, as I noted, you get on a plane, you don't even know what brand plane you're getting on anymore. The similarities are so different in the mature industry.
I don't know how to capture that as feedback for you, Jim, right? But
so, well, and the first one is within companies.
Within the company, sure. Yeah,
right. And so within your company, voluntary safety reporting, I would say I don't know. So, is it a closed system where, hey, if you report something up, you're gonna get fired, you're out of here, or is that, hey, if somebody reports safety issue, so I think that's what that first one is. And maybe that first bullet should be broken into 2 questions. I think that would make it much easier.
Yeah, that would make it easier, I think. Right. So,
yeah, good point. So I will make sure that
so, like, for example, right? We're not required to follow SMS type FAA rules, right? But some companies do.
Yes.
We've got an ASAP type reporting program within the company, that kind of thing, right? So
yeah.
But I think those are all internal, right?
I would say very robust internal reporting system. Safety mission assurance, absolutely.
Is there a scorecard or anything that we can use that would measure how companies are performing so that the sole burden isn't on the companies to come up with their own independent approaches? Is there a way that you could create we give out safety awards? Is there a in quality awards in industry, and they all have some kind of scorecard associated with it. Can we create a safety scorecard, and we use this somehow to measure the participants? I pose that as a question, as a way to help measure this.
I think you could create, I mean, the word scorecard makes it sound like a ranking, right? You could come up with a checklist of best practices, right? That you either have or don't have, right? But the ranking part is what, now you're trying to judge effectiveness, which gets, and relative effectiveness, which maybe gets a little complicated.
Well, maybe the cover story a little bit is, if these are international standards, okay, and we stand back and we don't treat them just as US standards, but we look at this as a means for foreign operators to work in our airspace, we could then use that same criteria to evaluate some of our own folks.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, just maybe some personal experience, right? We're struggling right now as we're trying to update our safety management system to look into manufacturing, which I know the aviation industry is doing. But coming from my background at NASA, right, I read those SMS advisory circulars, and my first reaction to that is, that's not safety, right? That's management of a safety operation, but that's not core safety, right? I'm much more into an engineering assurance model where NASA, right? And space part of aerospace tends to do that more often, right? So again, the yardstick for judging starts to give you the wrong answer because it's the wrong yardstick. Right? So Chris, yes, you could do that, but that's my biggest fear there, right? Is you're kind of fitting the wrong shoe on the wrong foot.
To the point of foreign operators, I don't, who would those be?
I don't know who those would be. Right?
They don't have the system.
Not for regular operations. Right?
Just for my query, is the intention.
So when you look at this chart, this is very subjective on how you determine whether these standards are being used and complied with, and where they came from. How do you remove some of the subjectivity out of this and make it a more standard-based approach? How can you improve the way you measure this?
Well, if I may, Mike, I think the point you're saying is that it might not be a standard approach because of the different operational environments that the providers use. And Jim, I think the best thing to do would be to reaching out to, well, there's maybe a handful right now, companies, Virgin, Blue, Axiom, maybe Boeing with CST 100, a couple others that you would have conversations with their teams, talk about what the approach looks like, see if there are some best practices out there, how we could create a list of best practices that could be shared amongst operators and just adapt it to the different operational constructs that people work in. That to me seem like a dialogue with the handful of operators out there, SpaceX and the others that, and see how
that sounds better, because the assumption going into this is it's a question of standards, and yet they're not standard.
True enough.
Yeah,
I think that was Mike's original point.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, they're not standard within, and then certainly not at all standard aviation.
Yeah, both points, right?
Yeah.
A lot of it is in the ConOps, right? That's
the ConOps.
And every single one of them is different because it's a different vehicle, different configuration, different system, different safety elements of it, depending whether it's airborne or vertical or parachute landing or propulsive landing or whatever it is.
And Greg, we've seen this right for the last 2 years in safety working group, right? It's that idea of you make it too generic of a question, you're not going to actually get anywhere, right? But if you can narrow it down, like you're saying, here's a handful of people doing it, what are they doing? You can actually get somewhere, right?
Yeah, you may be able to find
really
a
concrete
thread within that, having those discussions.
Yeah.
Could you turn this into create a library of best practices?
Yeah.
So just to understand the concept, as I understand what this is you have now the independent assessment on contract. these are the types of things they will be looking at, or the types of feedback you'll be looking to industry to get into that independent review?
This is for our report to Congress on the framework and the readiness for framework. The independent assessment, we won't have this kind of a input to that. I mean, they may interview us, they may talk with us. I could talk about that in a little bit, but that is a pure independent.
Okay.
So you're trying to answer the mail to the report to Congress.
So to our report to Congress.
Yeah, I would suggest, other people in the industry that you start having dialogue and see if there are common threads. Then you can go back to Congress and say, hey, we had these conversations, we're working on a plan to see if there's common best practices to put in place. It is a nascent industry, all these points, different operational constructs. And then you've scratched the itch and answered Congress on that point.
Hey, Jim, this is Andrew. Can I throw a point in here? Yeah. So, I mean, the one thing that the ASTM did was we started to kick this effort off with a standard guide for classifying safety-related events, just so people could have a common way of describing things. So that's one indication that, we're going in the right direction. The other piece of this was we had heard quite a bit from some of the members was that there was a concern also that the aviation industry has a code, a part of in Title 49 that basically gives them a safe harbor to voluntarily report safety issues, and that's not available for the space industry under Title 51. And so that's something that we might want to put into your report to Congress is that we need something similar from like the aviation industry has for space.
Chris, when we dealt with this also in a previous COMSTAC about 4 years ago, we looked at those voluntary reporting aviation.
And I know there is talk about that. One of the questions that I've gotten in looking at that, putting what's in 49 and 51 is kind of coming back around and saying, hey, well, if there is no voluntary safety reporting to the FAA or to the government, if you put this protection in, what are you protecting? Mm-hmm. Is this legislating before its time? Because there is that question. Hey, what are you getting? You're saying that there is a protection for voluntary safety reporting. Right. Is any company voluntarily reporting safety to you now?
Or is nobody reporting that?
Right. I think that's
that's what I'm getting at. That would be, yeah. Is it because are you not providing that voluntary safety reporting to AST because there's no protection, or because it's all proprietary and you weren't going to share that particular information?
Yeah, but when you do it, why would you do it? Is that statutory? It's got to be in law. To move it under, I can't remember what the numbers are. 151.
I don't know.
Does it have to be statutory, or is it done under regulation?
The
safe harbor.
Well, for the aviation world, it's under Title 49, and actually I can give you the exact code, but yeah, I think if it's under 49, then you probably want something similar under 51.
Yeah, but I would say that would probably be most appropriate under legislation.
That point, yeah.
Yeah, it's 40123 is the code under Title 49.
Asking industry, and I don't think there would be disagreement that it would be nice to have that as a safe harbor in case you wanted to report something. It's no foul in putting that in legislation and then having it in place. So if industry wanted to make that report, they could do it under safe harbor.
So industry, that'd be that. I will obviously let that up to you if you so feel.
Nice protection.
to make those recommendations to your points of contact, put that in. ASTM can, I guess, give you a little more information on it. You need that. All right. Next slide, please. I promise this.
Kevin, you were going to ask a question there. You wanna...
Well, I think you may have covered it. I know we're talking about standards here. I'm just looking at those two questions we had up front, and I take your point, Mike. I get what you're saying, and I think there's a way to maybe cast that narrative in a positive way, if you will. But I want to really get to the underlying intent of the question. Is the question really to assess safety culture across industry, or is it really about trying to see how industry compares with aviation?
The first. That's really how the
culture. So there can be variance.
Absolutely.
The question is, hey, are things being reported and shared within companies, and is that a part of the company's cultures, and is that widespread across the industry, which is probably a good news story.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, there is variance in terms of the issues that come up. So I think there's a way to maybe turn that into something.
That, yeah, much more supportive phrasing. Yeah, I agree.
All right, last slide. All right, roadmap and timeline towards a safety framework, and transition plan for such a framework, including those three things. Again, this is getting into some described specifics, so I'm not in this form asking for that, just to think about and give some general impressions on these questions.
It's a function of flight cadence, I would say.
Okay.
And once you start getting into regular operations, and when I say regular operations, I mean more than just a handful of times a year, right? When you're flying every month or every couple of weeks, or which by the way, SpaceX probably will get there soon enough. But on some of these other systems, that's where it's going to take a while to transition. I would think it will be over the next 5 years probably to build up to that kind of cadence, getting fleets in place, fleets of vehicles operating at a regular cadence until you have something that looks like a much more, larger framework that you could operate under. It's an observation.
Jim, my first impression is, right, this is actually a decent kickoff point to what we were talking about with the safety working group. Is what's that first step of a spark here, right? Is because the standards themselves aren't auditing and culture and data sharing, right? But the framework that wraps around is, right? So.
Yes. All right, any other thoughts or input on these? And anything out from those on Zoom or YouTube?
I have a comment on should the levels of safety assurance for spaceflight participants and crew be the same or different? The same way they can be, I think, but there are definitely some things like we discussed, long-term radiation exposure might just be different for crew inherently.
Yeah, I think there's some stuff down in the weeds, like back to the, there's stuff down in the weeds that you could say if a crew is actively flying, right, do they need a higher level of redundancy in their systems?
So therefore, it's to protect everyone.
Yeah.
Where you treat crew members as radiation workers and participants as not.
Yeah.
Tolerance.
All right. Anything else?
Jim, you said the intent here is to turn these into taskers for the next.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, was that out loud? That was my outside voice.
And as a reminder, COMSTAC can
Oh,
call upon member or previous members and industry to provide input and to brief them, as we've seen over the last couple of years.
The active reserve.
Exactly, yes. All right, if there's no other comments or thoughts on these, I appreciate your initial input. Looking forward to working more on those, and I will turn it back over to Charity and Karina.
Thank you, Jim. Just want to emphasize as other thoughts, once we get these slides and get a chance to think through them, any random thoughts, send them to Jim's way and CC Karina and myself. Okay, next on the agenda, we have public comments, 10 minutes. Karina, I see there's a few questions that are remaining from the public on our spreadsheet, but we can actually open it up. Anyone in the audience, yes, how are we going to do this? Maybe write your question down and we'll see it here.
We'll check in the Zoom chat. So if there's something else,
Yeah, I'm on the Google list here. Well, let me start with one that came in earlier. There's a question on the 1 in 100,000 level. So commenting in further detail on the off-nominal events measured at the 1 in 100,000 level. Do we recall which task that was for?
that was regulatory working group. Clay, do you
There's a question here about commenting further on off-nominal events measured at the 1 in 100,000 level.
I don't think Anne's on anymore, so I know she was.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I would defer that as she was the heart of that discussion.
Got it.
Talking to the stakeholder community.
There is one on AC order priority here. You had item number 10, which is malfunction trajectories. It's necessary for determining population exposure and/or airspace and waterborne vessel hazard areas. So can you elaborate why it's number 10?
And not higher on the list?
Exactly, when it's required for those other 2 items.
Which other 2?
The population exposure and airspace and waterborne vessel hazard areas.
6 and 9. Is that what they're saying?
6 and number 9. So what, 10 should be before 6? Is that the point?
I don't know.
I think the question really was, it sounds like, you know, why is this the priority area versus like something that might.
So there are, and Mike, maybe you can help me with this.
Yeah.
There are prescribed boxes here that you're flying in that go to that point.
Yeah, I don't think I mean, at least from my perspective, our input wasn't that nuanced that you must do one advisory circular before you do another. It was depending on whatever the current licensing results are, you need to put those hazard areas in place right now. And guidance on those is a little more relevant than how to tweak and completely calculate the trajectory analyses in the first place, right? We have an existing set of analysis rules, right? So that it was more of a nuance of the implementation part is where some of the confusion is right now, not necessarily the calculation part.
Yeah, and I'll just maybe note that the 450 as is the regulation.
Yeah.
So folks that are operating under 450 have the regulation now that they're writing their license application to. The advisory circulars are just some additional clarification on very specific topics. So the advisory circulars are not necessarily going to be applicable to all operators, but the 450 will be applicable to all operators.
I don't think there was any intent to make it 10 versus whatever.
Yeah,
It would have been 7. Yeah, but it's how people rank when we look at these things.
Not sure who can answer this one, potentially all of us or some of us. Will commercial and private companies become the bulk of the spaceflight industry? If so, will there be a certification for spacecraft maintenance personnel, as there is with commercial and private aviation? Takers on that, maintenance?
I'm always looking at the future. I think the answer is yes, but I'm not telling you when.
Yeah.
To both those statements.
We're already.
I think that's
already going to have.
Largely for the reason that Mike mentioned earlier, which is every vehicle is very different
Yeah.
from each other. So
in the industry, you start out with a whole diverse number of platforms, and a dominant design usually emerges both for production and operation, and a business model that usually standardizes, and then eventually you get these kind of interchangeable jobs with certifications. But I think that's a ways off.
It also goes to a very, I mean, again, based on fact, the historical roots of that, right? There's really good reasons why it's rooted that way, but it was a very prescriptive reason it was rooted. An AMT, ANP certificate is rooted in prescriptive, must follow these things, you know, to always hook those hydraulics that way, and spacecraft don't always follow that, right? So it's a good basis for certification, but to claim that it is an equivalent level of safety is, I think, a little bit short-sighted. So, but yeah, I think eventually.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you had tried to do that in 10 years after the aviation industry started, you'd have prescriptive rules that said what kind of wood and fabric you had to use in your airplane, right? We could still be stuck with those.
Yeah.
I don't know if the question is going to human spaceflight or just spaceflight overall. So that's my question, because commercial flights are already the bulk, right? Starlink is already the bulk of spaceflight right now. For human spaceflight, I think we're quickly getting there. It will, if not already, I can't do the math in my head, but we're already getting there with a number of commercial flights.
Next year, for sure.
For sure.
This next one is more of a comment, and it goes to the safety conversation that we had. What's this? Sorry, I'm trying to find out. David Sullivan. I'd recommend reaching out more to the International System Safety Society, the International Association for the Advancement of Space Safety, IAAS, American Conference of Governmental and Industry Hygienists, and the American Society of Safety Professionals to reach more stakeholders who do space safety in their day-to-day jobs. So there might be other lessons learned there.
Always good.
And a public comment. Did we have anything scheduled?
No.
Public comment? No.
Nothing scheduled.
Going once? Going twice. All right. I encourage, as always, public and stakeholders to reach out, probably through Jim's office, should you have additional questions and comments. And we encourage your participation throughout the entire year, not just during the COMSTAC days. Okay, moving on to, I guess, new business. So here's our chance to, if anything's weighing on your mind, perhaps want to sway Jim one way or the other on future tasks, or something that we hadn't really thought of, but is kind of in the 5 to 10 year lead that maybe we should start to think about, just much like we do with the HSAT stuff. Now's your time to bring any ideas up.
No, I just want to say it's an honor to have served on the COMSTAC, and I really enjoyed working with Karina and Charity and everybody in my group. Thank you.
I mean, I guess it's part of the ongoing discussion, but I mean, looking out 5 to 10 years with the rate of change, things that are happening as to whether things are going to fall within AST or commerce or something else. I mean, things like the cislunar highway and obviously lunar activities, those are all going to become clear and present issues. I don't know if they'd be handled here in the future Department of Commerce piece, but I think it's coming on us pretty fast. So many different things that are in the works right now.
Yeah, I do have to say that if all of the things we discussed don't fall under FAA AST purview, there is a need for a committee to bring industry's thoughts to bear on those topics.
One thing I sort of picked up, and tell me if I'm wrong here, there seems to be an interest on supply chain specifically. You know, where are those cracks in the supply chain for spaceports and launches, helium specifically? Maybe that's something to tinker with, or sure.
NASA just reached out to a bunch of companies about those critical supply chain things. I forget what, I have to go look up what it was done under, but it was, yeah, I think they're also readiness. Industry, commercial capabilities, whatever it is, our industry.
Any other comments or suggestions? So we will move on to, oh, we have one from Mary Lynn. Go ahead, Mary Lynn.
So at the risk of beating an obvious dead horse, workforce.
Got it, yeah.
Everybody in the room, I imagine, and certainly most people online or their companies are all being affected by the hiring squeeze. We had about a 30-year warning in this history in the country about this. Talked a lot about it, really didn't do very much about it. The aerospace industries, I think, have across the board been sensitized to it and aware of it. But at this point, I think it's a threat to competitiveness, not just among industry, but globally.
Department of Labor.
On that, Mary Lynn, do you think, aside from that, included in that could be ITAR restrictions of how aerospace or the space industry oftentimes must hire U.S. persons only, and other visas are not permitted to be hired?
I think we need a systematic look at it. And it needs, I mean, maybe the way to get the appropriate amount of attention focused on it is to look at it through a national security lens and a national competitiveness lens. This is not new. People have been talking about this for a long time. I'm not saying anything particularly original, but it's certainly affecting commercial space. I mean, and you know, the companies, we all talk among each other. Everybody's saying the same thing having to do with hiring. Everybody's facing the same crunch, and it's only going to get worse because the industry, to the credit of everybody here and a lot of other people, is becoming more and more successful and more visible. And while on the one hand, that pulls people more toward these careers, on the other hand, there's just a real short pipeline. It is affected by a number of issues such as ITAR and I mean, you know, the immigration, I'll just sort of, you know, name the boogie in the room. And I mean, you know, just sort of all the rest of it. I mean, we really just need to, I think this is one where my own 2 cents is industry needs to be using every available means to elevate this that it can. My bias.
Right, unless there are any other additional items to bring up, we'll move forward towards closing remarks, and I'll just kind of summarize some kind of to-dos or outstanding items that we'll get back to Jim, or Jim will get back to us on. I know that we're going to circulate the 440 MPL documentation to the COMSTAC membership. Please take a look at that and provide inputs. It is in a good spot right now, but want to make sure we have that ready to vote in the fall. We'll also have a safety working group write-up that will reflect the recommendations that we voted on today, and that will be coming soon. I have a note here for Jim. You know, we definitely want to start the conversation regarding MPL calculations before the next COMSTAC, so look forward to your support there. I get the feeling we're still interested in understanding what's happening in the interagency task force for spaceports. There's keen interest there. You're going to check on if there's any material out there for airport interest and activity on the effects of climate change. So you can kind of see if there's any overlap. I also see like it keeps bubbling up. You know, 4 years ago, tracking the use of standards for human spaceflight safety. So there's probably some lessons learned from previous COMSTACs, but something maybe we need to reattack as well. And then I also have interesting kind of safe harbor aspects, which is related to that track standards item. And of course, workforce, which is brought up this morning and Carolyn here. So that in the nutshell, I think we've had an incredibly productive couple days here. I'm really glad to have been here in person with you and online with the rest of the group all together. I wish you all the best. I want to thank you for your support, and I'll hand it over to Karina for any final words.
I won't take up too much more time. Just thank you all for your diligence in getting through these taskers. I think we accomplished a lot, and I'm kind of grateful that you're all stuck at home the first year to be able to get through a lot of tasks early on, and just really appreciate all of your work and thoughtfulness and inclusiveness of maybe the folks who are not here at the table with us right now. So I think the products that we've been submitting to AST are actually have been really useful, or at least in my opinion, will be useful to them going forward. And really looking forward to engaging, over the next couple of years. Even if some of you are departing COMSTAC, I am looking forward to engaging with you as we move forward with new tasks. And of course, thank you to Charity for your leadership. I can definitely see why Wayne reached out to you to lead this COMSTAC the last 2 years, and just really grateful for your diligence as well in leading us through this sort of difficult time.
With that, let me.
My figurative, hammer, gavel, thank you. I'm handing it over to you.
And with that, let me just extend this a little bit longer because you provide coffee and food, so I get an extra 5 minutes. All right, many of you know Charity as a space policy executive, helping to ensure global space sustainability, previously in government roles and now in the private sector. But something you may not know about her, and do we have the slide of her picture first? As a child, she dreamed about becoming an astronaut. In fact, she even went to space camp. To get to the goal of astronaut, she joined the Canadian Air Force, become a P3 aircraft navigator, and played a role in managing maritime traffic in the North Atlantic and Middle East. Probably not the same time, but Charity could do it. If anybody could, she could. She also helped coordinate Canadian government overflights of US airspace while in the Canadian Embassy. I'd like to think all of that experience helped provide the context for her leadership of COMSTAC, which has been outstanding for the last 2 years. And I know everybody keeps saying that, but it is so true. And I have been very blessed to have you as the COMSTAC chair. And you have brought this group along just incredibly. I know I've passed on some really tough tasks. And thank you for taking them, Dale. So thank you for all that help and helping our community think through the challenges of space launch, traffic coordination, oversight, and all the different things that we are involved with. Everything from STEM to climate change, to spaceports, to the whole bit. It started out with, I think, 8 or 9, and we've done 19 different tasks. I don't know if that includes today's, but 19 is a lot in 2 years. So thank you for that. Just a couple other comments before I ask Kelvin if he has any closing remarks. I said there's a couple pieces of information I wanted to pass on. The Spark for 440, we are getting close. Again, thank you to all of you on COMSTAC for your recommendations on what industry and agencies and organizations should be involved with those Sparks. So 440, it's taking longer than I ever expected, but it's coordination. We have it. It's almost there. So we're a few months away from getting it chartered. But I'm very excited about that, and I will be the actual government co-chair for 440. The Spark for 460 is just a few steps behind that one. So that will be coming out shortly. And again, thank you for your help with those. I'm going to be putting together, and I think yesterday you heard Randy talk about a couple workshops on safety. There's another one that we're going to be putting together because we found out that there's some, not misunderstandings, but there's some questions on the MOA between the FAA and the Department of the Air Force on launch and reentry at the ranges and other DoD installations. So we're going to put together a workshop and invite industry. Again, it'll be hybrid, or not really hybrid, it'll be virtual. That way people can attend and they don't need to come here for an hour or two to workshop. But we're going to put that together, and we'll include Air Force, or actually Space Force now, and us, and walk through that and make sure we get questions answered. On the reports to Congress, we are working very hard to get the third and final voluntary consensus standards report over to Congress. And you heard Joel talk this morning that those reports are critical. So again, appreciate all your inputs to those. The one that we just kind of worked on is from the CSLCA, the new safety framework report. We're working hard on that, and that's one we've asked Aerospace to help us on. The independent assessment, per your recommendation, it's independent, and you had mentioned, I think, MITRE or Aerospace or something. We actually asked RAND. I want it to be absolutely fully independent, and as of yesterday, they received their notice to proceed. So if you get a call from RAND, this is what that's about, because I'm sure they'll be reaching out to different companies, and I'm going to recommend that they reach out to the members of COMSTAC kind of as a first entry in, if they don't have a different entry into your company to ask, or your organization. And then another note, along with the other deorbiters that we've heard about yesterday, Clay will also be deorbiting from COMSTAC. So we have quite the list. So I think there's 16 people that will be deorbiting. I'm not sure what's that's going to do to the climate, but I'm sure climate will change because of that. All right, that is. Let me just double check my notes. Yep, that's all I had. So is closing. Thank you very much again. There's still more cookies and goodies out there. Please fill up your pockets, whatever, or just stand out there and eat. There's no reason you have to rush off from our standpoint. So if you want to enjoy a cup of coffee, actually there's no more coffee left. If you want to enjoy some tea, water, something like that, talk, etc. This is a good chance to have everybody together. So with that, Kelvin, do you have any last thoughts for this austere group?
Yeah, first of all, hey, thank you, Jim. Great job with the committee. I really appreciate your work. And, I've already said it to you, Charity. I'll say it again. Thank you so much for your leadership for the past couple of years. And thank you all for, taking time out of your regularly scheduled programming. I know you all have day jobs and you're really busy. And so to spend 2 days here with us at the FAA to give us the expert advice that you have has been extremely valuable to us. It helps our program out. You're helping us to help you all out. So we really appreciate that, and it's deeply valued and greatly appreciated. So I know y'all want to get out of here. I won't be long-winded, so I'll just say thank you to you all this one last time, and let us know how we can help you out, because you surely have helped us out. So appreciate it. Thank you.
I'd like to say something.
Okay, absolutely.
I wanted to thank Kelvin because he has stepped up over the years to make sure this office continues to operate seamlessly, and you've been an outstanding leader. And I haven't been a member of COMSTAC this first time I was, but not recently for more than 2 years. But what I've seen is a growth in the capability of the office that is superb, and I'd like to credit you with that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you.
All right, one last thing that I promised the Office of Science and Technology that I would put up. Federal Register notice came out today. The ISAM is requesting for comment. So that is the link. We'll put it on the COMSTAC page, but I said that I would mention that to the COMSTAC members. They want to get it out as far and wide and get comments back. Again, in fact, what we'll do is we'll just send it out to an email to you all. So you will have it. All right, unless there's anything else, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.